Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and today I'm going to be talking about At Lady Molly's by Anthony Powell, which is the fourth book in his series A Dance to the Music of Time, which I'm currently hosting a read-along for. So I'm currently hosting a 12-month-long readathon of Anthony Powell's A Dance to the Music of Time, which is a wonderful series that I would highly, highly recommend. In the month of June, we read this, which is the fourth book in the series, and one I really, really loved. At Lady Molly's is a fantastic book. I'd forgotten a lot of it from my first reading of the series, and it was really nice to rediscover it. What I will do in this video, as I have done for the previous videos for this read-along, is talk briefly through what happens in the plot of this book, and then talk a bit about some of the things I really like about it and a few of the important characters and themes here. So we start off the book with a flashback back to Nick's childhood, talking about his family's relationship with General and Mrs. Conyers, a couple which crop up throughout the book. And then we follow Nick back in his adult life. He has moved from working for a publishing company to working in sort of the story development in a film company, and he works alongside a man called Chip Lovells, who takes him to a party of a woman called Lady Molly, a relation of his, through which he ends up meeting Mrs. Conyers again after all these years, and also meets Wimmerpool, who is now suddenly engaged to Mrs. Conyers' sister. Later on in the book, Nick goes into the countryside to visit Quiggin and his wife, Mona, who used to be married to Nick's friend Peter Templar, and while there he is introduced to the kind of landlord of the Quiggins, Alf Tolland, and also to Alf Tolland's sisters, Isabel and Susan. In the latter section of the book, Nick also ends up on a rather strange night out with Lady Molly's husband, Jevons, in which they end up going to a nightclub where Nick runs into Peter Templar and also Wimmerpool and Wimmerpool's fiancée. And then finally, in the last chapter of the book, we learn several things of significance, all of which seem to happen kind of off stage. One is that Wimmerpool's engagement has broken off and he is not going to marry Mildred anymore. The other thing we learn is that Mona has left Quiggin and run off with Alf Tolland, and the other thing we learn is that Nick and Isabel are now engaged. So, to talk quickly about a few of the things I really enjoyed about Lady Molly's. I'd forgotten how much I enjoy the Tollands as a family. There's so many siblings and they all have such interesting characters and personalities, and they're all dealt with so fascinatingly. And I like that we hear quite a lot about the Tollands in the beginning of the book at Lady Molly's parties before we actually meet them. I also love the parties in this book. I find Lady Molly a really interesting character, and the kind of scene she sets and the way she invites so many people to her house and the way people flock to her and how odd the parties usually are, how there is such a great kind of social mix of people coming, and how Nick and Isabel are quite confused when a party is thrown for their engagement, that they don't really know anyone there and they can't really understand why Lady Molly has chosen to invite the people that she has for that particular occasion. It's something I find really, really entertaining and a dynamic I really enjoy throughout the book. One of the things I love about the books within this series that are set in the interwar period is the way they look at kind of social change and the kind of party scene, I suppose. It's a really, really interesting time period to look at how sort of high society is changing. I also really like the role of the film industry in this book. Obviously it's not a massive part of the book, but I think it's really interesting that that's an industry that Nick gets involved with, especially because, you know, this book is set in the 1930s and the kind of film industry of that time is very, very interesting and very dynamic and changing, and it's quite important, I suppose, that Nick gets involved with that particular world and to see how that relates to sort of older forms of artistry like writing and novels and so on. Another thing I think is really, really brilliant in this book is the plotline of Wimmerpool's engagement, and especially those very, very, very awkward conversations that Wimmerpool has with Nick about trying to have sex with Mrs. Haycock. It's so embarrassing for all concerned, but Nick also kind of takes this weird sort of pleasure in discussing such thing with Wimmerpool and knowing about his life, and it's also quite weird, I think, that Wimmerpool obviously chooses Nick for this role because he kind of views Nick as being somewhat less respectable than himself, so the kind of person he can have these conversations with. The plot of Wimmerpool's engagement is quite sad in many ways, but it also has its very, very funny moments, which is one of the things I think Wimmerpool is such a complicated character for, having moments where you feel appallingly sorry for him while also being quite entertained by his attitudes. He's obviously so ill-suited to Mrs. Haycock in so many ways. I also wanted to mention one other thing I really enjoy in this book is Nick and Isabel's relationship, and obviously it's not something we see much of, but I kind of like that, and I kind of like that throughout the series Isabel and Nick's relationship is not at the forefront to a large degree. Partly, I think, because we do know that A Dance to the Music of Time is sort of semi-autobiographical, or at least kind of inspired by Anthony Powell's life, and I have a biography of Anthony Powell I'd like to read once I finish this series to see how closely inspired it is by his life. But because we do know that a lot of the book was kind of taken from or inspired by Anthony Powell's life, you know, I have it in my head that Isabel was probably based on his wife, and so it seems almost a kind of respect that Isabel is not subject to the same kind of analysis that a lot of other characters are in The Way We Live Now. I'll talk about this a bit more as the series goes on as well, and I really like Isabel. I think we get sort of glimpses of her character throughout, but their relationship is not really described. We don't really know how they get engaged. We see how they meet, and then the next thing we know is that they're engaged, and that's kind of all. But I do love the first moment when they meet and they see each other, and I love the way that the narrator describes it, so I will just read that passage because I think it's great. Would it be too explicit, too exaggerated to say that when I set eyes on Isabel Tolland, I knew at once that I should marry her? Something like that is the truth, certainly nearer the truth than merely to recall those vague, incoherent sentiments of interest of which I was so immediately conscious. It was as if I had known her for many years already, enjoyed happiness with her and suffered sadness. I was conscious of that, as of another life, nostalgically remembered. Then, at that moment, to be compelled to go through all the paraphernalia of introduction, of getting to know one another by means of the normal formalities of social life seemed hardly worthwhile. We knew one another already. So to talk about some of the characters in this book, I've already spoken about Isabel a little bit, and obviously she does remain somewhat of a mystery to us in a way that I quite like. I find her dialogue very, very funny, and we do get a certain sense of her character, but it is limited. But there are quite a lot of other characters that I want to discuss, so we'll start off with Mrs. and General Conyers. One of the things I always find really interesting in Anthony Powell's books is the way that he looks at the kind of division between pre-First World War life and post-First World War life. And Nick and his generation belong to the post-World War I life. But people like General and Mrs. Conyers don't. And the way that Nick kind of looks at the divide between the generations and just how much World War I has increased that divide, that regular, usual divide between the generations is really, really interesting, and the way he does it in those characters is really interesting. He has a very nice relationship with them, and they view him almost parentally, I think, to a certain extent. Or at least maybe Mrs. Conyers does. I'm not sure it's quite the same with General Conyers. And obviously General Conyers has this kind of odd exchange with him at the end, telling him sort of salacious gossip about Widenpool, because he seems to think that Nick is the kind of person who will enjoy that, and because there is a part of him, a kind of younger part of him, I suppose, that quite enjoys spreading those kind of stories. They're quite an interesting couple as well to look at the differences between them, but also to look at the way Mrs. Conyers seems to feel rather out of place sometimes in modern social life, especially at occasions like Lady Molly's, and often even with her sister, who certainly is presented as being kind of more modern than her. Another interesting couple in this book are, of course, Lady Molly and Jevons, who seem to lead quite different lives and who are both quite interesting characters. I really like Jevons, actually, and I think he is... You get to see a certain side of him because Nick finds him really interesting, whereas everyone else seems to find him really boring, which I find quite entertaining. And yet you do see kind of odd, different sides of him. Sometimes he's quiet and odd and doesn't really seem to have many social manners. When at the sort of gatherings at Lady Molly's house, Mark Members meets him and is really kind of like disgusted and confused by him, whereas Nick finds him quite interesting. And when we see him on that night out, kind of reliving his younger days and talking about Mildred Haycock, you do get a sort of sense of a different side of his character, independent from Lady Molly. Also quickly want to talk about Quiggin, Mona and Alf Tolland. Alf Tolland, also known as Warminster, also known as Eridge. He has so many different names to do with weird title things, which I could probably work out if I thought about it, but I don't. Not going to do that here. Quiggin and Alf are quite interesting, I think, to compare to each other. Obviously, they hold the same political views. Both of them are socialists and really strongly believe in that programme, but their very different backgrounds and their very different attitudes towards it have affected the way both of them act. Also, they have very different personalities. Quiggin is sort of louder and more abrupt and sometimes more confrontational than Alf is. Alf has no interest in food or drink and is kind of constantly confused at the constant need for alcohol on his friends, which he doesn't really quite understand. And although he is a socialist and although he has rejected the kind of aristocratic home he's been brought up in enough to live in one small quarter of it, he also quite enjoys showing off the house and giving Nick and the others a tour because he does have that kind of conflict within him. Quiggin and Mona have an interesting and complicated relationship, and I find it very interesting that at the end of the book Mona runs off with Alf in a way that surprises Nick, because although he isn't that surprised at Mona, he is more surprised at Alf, whom he never really seemed to think had that kind of interest in Mona. And the impression you certainly get from Mona throughout her appearances in the books is that she is really quite bored. Life doesn't really seem to have enough for Mona, so she moves from partner to partner in the hopes of kind of finding a more interesting life. She has potential ideas of being an actress, but nothing really seems to come of it, and we see when she's living with Quiggin the very, very similar tensions to the kind that she had with Templar. Before I move on to the themes, I also do want to quickly talk about Widmerpool, because he is such an interesting character. I've said before that I feel like the series is almost as much about Widmerpool as it is about Nick. It's interesting as well, of course, that in this book, we start off the book finding that Widmerpool is engaged to be married and Nick is still single, and as Widmerpool points out in the last party in the book, by the end of the book, Nick is now engaged to be married and Widmerpool is once more single. As I already spoke about in this video, Widmerpool is a weird mix between being kind of sympathetic and a character you can really feel sorry for, especially in the breakup of his engagement, because while Nick seems to doubt whether necessarily Widmerpool has fallen in love, he obviously has a certain emotional attachment to Mildred, because there are reasons why if he didn't it wouldn't be strictly sort of practical to marry her. I think you can feel very sorry for Widmerpool for the breakup of his engagement, especially because of the kind of embarrassing circumstances in which it occurs, but also Widmerpool remains kind of condescending to Nick and somewhat unappealing in many ways. It's also interesting to look at how Widmerpool is viewed by Nick and by those around him. When Nick runs into Widmerpool in the company of Peter Templar at a nightclub, he realises that Peter Templar views Widmerpool now as the kind of person that you would go to a nightclub with, but he's also slightly embarrassed when he runs into Nick there, who sees him with Widmerpool. Nick finds it slightly odd that Widmerpool is engaged to someone that Nick met as a child and someone who is quite a bit older than himself. And throughout the kind of questioning of Nick about Mildred's engagement from the Conyers, we learn new things about what the rest of the world think about Widmerpool. The idea that he's made lots of enemies, that he is quite tough in the city. We learn a bit more about his business life and what people think of him, and he is such a fascinating character. I want to talk a little bit about some of the themes in this book. I mentioned already the kind of theme of past and present, the sort of pre-World War I world with the current world, especially this book being set in the 1930s. We get mentions of Hitler and sort of European politics at the time. There is the kind of looming threat of war, though quite distant, especially remembering these books were written in the 1950s, so they would have been written and read with kind of hindsight of knowing what happened afterwards. We get this kind of theme of war in a way in this book through General Connors and also through kind of Jevons's reflections on meeting Mildred during World War I and their kind of very brief affair when he was on leave. We get this kind of clash between the past and the present, which brings kind of war as a possibility into the kind of present moment. Which leads me on, I suppose, to talking briefly about the kind of background of politics in this book. We're hearing more about fascism and socialism. There are mentions of Hitler and what's going on in Germany, and we're starting to get a sense of where this book is in time and where things are leading. It's very interesting to see that the way people engage with politics. We also have characters like Widmerpool, who is coming round to socialism more, and of course we have Quiggin and Alf and the way they represent socialism and mentions of strikes and so on. Marriage is also a really interesting theme in this book, both in terms of Nick's engagement to Isabel by the end of the book and in terms of Widmerpool's failed engagement, and also if we look at the marriages that we see throughout the book, the Conyers and the Jevonses, two sort of older couples with quite interesting relationships and dynamics, which are really interestingly explored in this book. I kind of look at the theme of marriage and the possibilities of marriage. And then we also have the kind of Quiggin-Mona marriage, which is not actually legally a marriage, but is kind of taken as one. And then of course she leaves, sort of showing the kind of fragility of marriage, I suppose, to a certain extent within this world. And yet, although marriage is presented as being quite fragile, I'll talk about this a little bit more in a moment in terms of the younger generation, we also have couples like General and Mrs. Conyers who have been together for a very long time, and also couples like Lady Molly and Jevons who seem to stick with each other despite some differences and despite some nights where Jevons goes out on his own to kind of get that out of his system, but then they still carry on together. The theme of social change and the way that kind of changes how marriage and so many other things work is really interesting in this book and throughout the series. As I said, we do have these kind of two stable older marriages, but we also have the collapse of a lot of relationships. Widmerpool and Mildred get engaged, but it doesn't work out. Mona leaves Quiggin for Alf after having already left Templar for Quiggin. Umferville's new marriage that was formed at the end of the last book is over already. And in terms of social change, I think it's also worth looking at Eleanor Walpole-Wilson and Nora Tolland, who are very, very clearly in a relationship and living together at openly gay, and people seem kind of okay with it. It's not really addressed, and there is some sort of discomfort within her family, but there isn't masses of it. In general, Nora seems to be relatively accepted by her family, which I think gives you quite a strong sense of sort of social change and changing social attitudes in the 1930s in comparison to what it would have been like 30 years before. So I think that's pretty much all I wanted to say on Lady Molly's. I really enjoyed this one, definitely one of my favourites so far in the series, and I'm really looking forward to reading the 5th book in the month of July, and that is Casanova's Chinese Restaurant. It's been weird actually rereading this series because I read them when I was 17, but I really don't remember very much about them at all, so it's really lovely rediscovering them, and every now and then a character will appear and I'll suddenly remember something important about them later on. But I feel like I remember books 1 to 3 and I remember books like 7 to 9, but somehow books 4, 5 and 6 I've like got like a lot of it has just gone from my brain. So yeah, I've been really enjoying rereading this series and I hope you're enjoying them too. Please let me know down in the comments what you thought of Lady Molly's, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.